I mean, do you think that's the way that we're just our world is going to exist now? Is like you described it as that like cesspool of false information. Like, is that just what we're going to have to wade through on like a day-to-day basis?
I think so, or at least in the near term. I mean, obviously, I want to be optimistic and hope solution down the road because it's not a very pleasant world to live in, honestly, where the information online is just untrustworthy. Everyone feels like it's being manipulated. Our sense of an objective truth starts to erode. But this is one of the things that we talked about after 2016. Is like, yes, we knew what the Russians did. Whether or not it was effective is, I think, still open to debate. But one of the things we highlighted is like it was kind of sophisticated, but it kind of wasn't. I mean, the troll operation out of St. Petersburg, the stuff they were putting out was not some sort of psyops. It was not a sort of psyops level where you then looked at, okay, though, they definitely had some impact. So you're having anyone now who has any sort of political motivation, who has economic motivation, any sort of cause they care about, looks at the sort of Russian roadmap from 2016 and says, like, I can do that for for cheap. I can probably do it better. If they're domestic within the U.S., they're unlikely to be, if you have any level of sophistication, they're unlikely to be caught by the social media companies because they're looking at domestic actors. So what we were concerned about, what we saw was this sort of proliferation of bad actors who would see how cheap, how easy, how effective this is, and would launch their own sort of disinformation operations. So I think what we're going to see is this sort of democratization of influence campaigns, info ops, but also what we have seen is the commercialization of it. So now you do not have to be technically sophisticated to run essentially your own sort of troll farm or your own kind of bot spamming campaign. There are plenty of companies that you just need to Google to find who will run these campaigns for you. Is that going to swing a national election? No. But if you're talking down at the like local level, if you've got some mayoral race, if you have a ballot measure, that people don't go into it with any sort of preconceived notions of what they believe in. It's very different from a national election where people are kind of Republicans, they're Democrats, very hard to change their opinions. You're talking about an issue that people don't know much about. California, for example, every year has like 20, 30 different ballot measures. Nobody knows what they're about. They're very complicated. They're written by special interests. Nobody knows what they're voting on. So it's all about the information out there. I think what we're going to see in the future is just these massive professional disinfo campaigns targeted at these smaller elections, again, these ballot measures, and those can have a huge impact. So that's my concern now going forward is like everyone has learned over the past 4 years that if you want to manipulate the truth, if you want to manipulate voters, it's really not that difficult.
Yeah, I mean, like, do you really think that so you mentioned that you don't think this like sort of targeted trolling campaign could swing a national election. Are you familiar with the idea of Trevor's axiom?
I'm not, no.
Okay, so I actually wrote about this in my book. This is an excellent opportunity to plug it. And I honestly haven't been able to find an earlier source of this term or an earlier explanation of this term than South Park. They did an absolutely stunning explanation of how it works. It's like a 30-second video. I'll put it in the link below. But essentially, they say that like all that it requires to like blow up certain hot button issues and turn them into national conversations is like the right trolling. So like all you have to do is like abuse one person, and it doesn't even have to be like someone like specifically bad, but all you're trying to do is like get someone to respond to that in such a self-righteous way that other people who may not agree with the original troll jump on the other person, and it just like explodes out with people just being hypocritical or self-righteous or stupid or provocative for the fun of it, or all just like misconstrued in the 140 280 character replies that we get. And essentially we're the thesis is basically that I think we might be like missing how much blowing something up with just like a tiny amount of influence can actually affect a national like conversation. One of the examples I use in my book is there was a couple of like terror attacks during the 2017 or in the run up to the UK 2017 election. And one guy had tweeted, this troll, I think it's Lone Star something. He had tweeted a picture of this like this woman in a burqa or in a headdress, like walking past like a victim or someone who had been like almost hurt by in the attack. And it would like the caption was like, oh, here, look, this person's just walking by, ignoring, good British citizens who have been hurt by the victims of terrorism. And it turns out she was on her phone, like calling an ambulance.
Yeah, no, I know that image. Yeah.
Yeah, and it blew up, and the next day it was on the front page of the Daily Mail. So like, are you that confident that these things can't like blow up to affect?
No, not at all. No, to be clear, I sort of meant these kind of for-profit, spend $1,000, get a company in Belarus or the Philippines to run this sort of low-grade troll operation for you. Right, okay. But no, what you pointed out, I agree with entirely, and it's one of the issues that we have struggled, I think, to get across to people, because everybody is looking for the sort of cause and effect of a disinformation campaign and saying, often looking at metrics that I think are completely flawed, and particularly on social media saying, well, like, this account had 250 followers and was only retweeted 20 times. Looking at engagement metrics as our measure of effect of the influence of the campaign, I think it is so deeply, deeply flawed, because what we talk about is often the sort of term information laundering, and the ability to put a piece of information out there, and the original piece of information doesn't need to get a ton of traction on its own. It just, as you pointed out, it needs to find the right person or group who take it and run with it. And then it kind of gains momentum on its own. It becomes this sort of organic movement. AstroTurfed, but like it takes a life of its own. And that's why it's so difficult to get to the impact question. I can't tell you the amount of times over the last 4 years we've been asked by journalists, like, does this matter? Did this have any impact? And often it's, I don't know, because it's impossible to judge. You could look at the end results of saying, like, this campaign looked to get this person elected, that person got elected. There's a causation correlation issue there. But then there's often the efforts to kind of minimize a campaign by saying, like, well, this is an obscure website, doesn't get a lot of traffic. Very hard to track, though. One person sees it, that plants a sort of seed in their mind. They do a bit of their own research. They put their own spin on it. And then it's the second article that causes the real accelerant and causes a movement to take hold. So no, to be clear, I do think trolling campaigns, even kind of low-level trolling campaigns, can be effective enough to at least impact national elections or national campaigns. But what I was saying is more that a lot of this stuff is not really intended to do that. And most of it is run by people who are not particularly sophisticated, but it's always tough to measure the impact of a campaign.
Tim Pool talks a lot about the idea of fifth generational warfare, that like the idea that nations will engage in like physical war in the fashion that we've seen in history, like even up to like the Vietnam War or Iraq, or even like anything like that where physical troops are on the ground. And he basically thinks that those days are gone, essentially, and that we're engaged in this like this type of like information war with we have no idea who. Like in that kind of context, like where concerns you more? Is it like Russia, or is it China, or is it, say, like our own citizens or governments? Like where is the biggest threat, do you think, right now?
I'll give a cop-out answer and say all of the above, but if I'm weighing them, I would say it is our own governments, but more our own citizens, our fellow citizens. So it's kind of a cliche, but I think it's true. When people live in a society that they feel is equitable and just, and they trust their government and they feel like they're being represented, these external threats become less of a threat, right? I mean, particularly if you're looking at more of the sort of Russian style campaign, which is to amplify divisions and that kind of thing, like that is just not going to be effective if you don't have individuals on the ground in a targeted country who have these real or perceived grievances that they're able to exploit. So like, I look at the domestic issue as being the far bigger issue. And, everyone always says when we have these conversations, like, we need to improve trust in government and, solve some of these cohesion issues. Obviously, that's way easier said than done. But of course, that is the underlying issue that allows foreign actors to, exploit those things. Of the two, if you're looking at Russia and China, I mean, Russia's way better at information warfare right now than China, at least globally. I mean, China is, I think, effective in its own sort of backyard to a degree. But if you look at sort of Russian versus Chinese trolling efforts that have targeted the US, I mean, they're not even close in terms of sophistication. So in the near term, again, this is sort of it was an original term or sort of concept 3 or 4 years ago now, but it'd be cliche. But looking at Russia as the sort of category 3 hurricane that can cause a lot of damage in the near term, but doesn't kind of fundamentally alter, the sort of global interest in the way that China is more like climate change. They have the ability to really kind of rewrite the rules. And they have levers that Russia just does not have in terms of their economic levers. So I look at China as the bigger long-term threat in general. Russia is the bigger threat in the near term, just because I think they're much, much better at information warfare than the Chinese right now. But, the Chinese certainly have the capacity. They have the AI capabilities to radically improve, for lack of a better term, over the next several years. But to go back to your original question, like, my concern is always domestic more than anything. And when we were looking at the 2020 election, this is the thing we were kind of trying to stress over and over is, yeah, you got to be concerned about the Russians, the Chinese, I mean, to some degree, the Venezuelans, the Iranians, but like the real threats are going to come within. And that's obviously what happened.
Thanks so much for listening. If you haven't already and you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to this podcast and to our mailing list. And don't forget, my book, Brexit, The Establishment Civil War, is now available for pre-order on Amazon. You'll find the link in the description below. Until next time, thanks so much for listening.